In the autumn of 1929, the American economy appeared stronger than ever. Stock prices had climbed steadily for years. Industrial output had doubled since the end of the First World War. Unemployment remained low, and consumer confidence reached levels never before recorded. To most observers, the nation had entered a new era of permanent prosperity. But beneath this surface of wealth, structural weaknesses had been building for nearly a decade. Agricultural prices had been falling since 1920, leaving rural America in quiet decline while cities boomed. Income inequality had widened dramatically, with the wealthiest 1% controlling nearly a quarter of all national income. And perhaps most critically, stock values had risen far beyond what corporate earnings could justify. The warning signs were present, but they went largely unnoticed. A handful of economists questioned whether stock prices could continue rising indefinitely. Some bankers expressed private concerns about the amount of borrowed money flowing into the market. But these voices were drowned out by a prevailing optimism that seemed to be confirmed month after month by rising numbers. The Federal Reserve faced a dilemma it had never encountered before. Created only 16 years earlier, the institution was still learning how to manage a modern economy. Officials could see that speculation was driving stock prices higher, but they worried that raising interest rates too aggressively might choke off legitimate economic growth. They chose a middle path, implementing modest increases that proved too small to cool speculation, but large enough to slow industrial expansion. By the summer of 1929, factory production had begun to decline. Construction starts were falling. Consumer spending showed signs of weakening. Yet stock prices continued to climb, disconnected from the economic reality beneath them. Investors bought shares on margin, putting down as little as 10% and borrowing the rest, convinced that prices would keep rising. When the market finally broke in late October, the collapse came with stunning speed. Prices that had taken years to climb fell in a matter of days. Margin calls forced investors to sell, which pushed prices lower, triggering more margin calls in a downward spiral that seemed impossible to stop. Billions of dollars in paper wealth vanished. But the stock market crash alone did not create the depression that followed. What turned a financial panic into a decade-long economic catastrophe was the series of policy responses that came next, and more importantly, the responses that did not come. Banks began to fail at an accelerating rate. In a system without deposit insurance, each failure sparked fear among depositors at other banks. Worried savers rushed to withdraw their money, forcing even healthy banks to call in loans and sell assets at depressed prices. This contagion spread across the country, destroying the mechanism through which credit flowed to businesses and farmers. The Federal Reserve had the power to act as a lender of last resort, providing cash to solvent banks facing temporary runs. But officials hesitated, bound by traditional thinking that viewed economic downturns as necessary corrections. Many believed that propping up weak banks would only delay inevitable adjustments. This philosophy, rooted in decades of economic theory, led them to stand aside while the banking system contracted. As banks failed and credit disappeared, businesses found themselves unable to borrow for normal operations. Factories cut production. Employers laid off workers. Farmers, already struggling with low prices, lost access to the loans they needed to plant crops. Each business failure put more people out of work, and each newly unemployed worker reduced consumer spending further. The federal government, under President Hoover, believed strongly in balanced budgets and limited intervention. When tax revenues fell due to the declining economy, officials cut spending to match, which reduced demand even more. Hoover did support some relief efforts and public works programs, but these measures were too small and came too late to reverse the downward momentum. International trade collapsed as countries raised tariffs to protect domestic industries. The United States led this movement with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930, which imposed the highest import duties in American history. Other nations retaliated with their own tariffs, and global trade volumes fell by more than half. This further deepened the economic contraction, turning what might have been a severe recession in one country into a worldwide depression. The gold standard, which tied currencies to fixed amounts of gold, prevented countries from using monetary policy to fight the downturn. When gold flowed out of a country, its money supply contracted automatically. This mechanism, designed to maintain stable exchange rates, meant that nations could not increase their money supply to offset falling prices and economic activity. Countries remained locked in this system for years, unable or unwilling to abandon a monetary framework that had governed international trade for generations. By 1933, unemployment in the United States had reached 25%. Industrial production had fallen by nearly half from its 1929 peak. Thousands of banks had closed their doors permanently. Farmers lost their land to foreclosure. Families lost their homes. The economic decline that began with a stock market crash had metastasized into a crisis that touched every aspect of American life. What made this economic collapse particularly costly was not any single decision, but rather the accumulation of reasonable-seeming choices that, in hindsight, reinforced each other's worst effects. Central bankers who valued financial orthodoxy over emergency action. Political leaders who prioritized balanced budgets over economic stimulus. Economists who believed that markets would self-correct without intervention. Each group acted according to the prevailing wisdom of their time. The mistake was not merely technical, but philosophical. It stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern economies functioned and what role government and central banks needed to play during a severe crisis. The institutions existed that might have prevented or shortened the depression, but the will to use them in unprecedented ways did not. The Great Depression eventually ended, but only after more than a decade of hardship and the massive economic mobilization of the Second World War. The cost in human terms defied easy calculation. A generation grew up in poverty. Skills atrophied during years of unemployment. Lives were shaped by deprivation that need not have been so severe or lasted so long. In the decades that followed, policymakers learned different lessons from the catastrophe. Central banks accepted responsibility for providing liquidity during financial crises. Governments created deposit insurance to prevent bank runs. Economists developed new theories about how to manage demand during severe downturns. These changes did not prevent all future economic problems, but they reflected a recognition that the passive approach of the early 1930s had deepened and prolonged an avoidable disaster. The prosperity of the 1920s had been real, but it rested on foundations more fragile than anyone wanted to acknowledge. When those foundations cracked, the institutions that might have contained the damage instead stood by, bound by orthodoxy and caution. The result was not just a stock market crash or even a severe recession, but an economic unraveling whose effects rippled across the world and through the decades that followed, a costly reminder that inaction in the face of crisis carries its own profound consequences.